particular practice. Again, use your antitrust laws, your laws against restrictive competition. Is the problem that something is a natural monopoly in the sense that there's a big network, and this big network is going to be able to produce at a very low average cost? It's going to be very hard for anyone else to compete. Well, in that case, if you do have to regulate, at least regulate prices using price cap regulation rather than cost plus regulation. Is the problem that you have a regulated industry or a legal monopoly, like maybe the post office, whose time really has passed for being a legal monopoly? Or like the airline industry, whose time has really passed for being a regulated industry? Then the answer may be to deregulate it. Is it a case where we're worried about some regulation for safety or security, like in the case of airlines and banks, but we're not worried about regulation in terms of overall price and quantity? Well, go after the regulation that you're worried about. Go after the concerns about safety. Go after the concerns about whether financially prudent rules are being followed. But you don't need to regulate all the prices and quantities in the industry in order to do that. Most of all, it's important to recognize that when you have a market, it's reacting to supply and demand, and it's always going to be true in these kinds of markets that suppliers would like a higher price and demanders would like a lower price. Regulation can't fix that problem. Regulation is not going to be able to make sure that every consumer can have a low electricity bill, but electricity producers for solar power and wind power can get high prices to help encourage the supply of alternative energy. Regulation is always going to have to face the reality that some people are going to be unhappy with whatever price exists. Now, these lectures have focused on lack of competition and how, when there's a lack of competition, firms can take advantage of consumers. Future issues in the next few lectures will focus on other policy issues like pollution and poverty and many other issues as well. But ultimately, as we move on to those other issues, there's going to be one lesson that continues. And that is, the study of economics is always going to offer us a reminder to respect the power of market forces. When those forces are producing socially beneficial results, of course, it's not hard to respect them. We just let them roam free. But when market forces are producing undesirable outcomes, it's important for the economic policy to recognize those forces and to work with the market forces, even as it seeks to come up with socially preferred outcomes. Strong environmentalists sometimes see the free market as the enemy. But is it really true that a free market is the enemy of a clean environment? Or to put it a little more bluntly, is there a opposition between economics and environmentalism? The connections here are a little less obvious than they may at first appear. It certainly can be true that profit-seeking firms operating in an unregulated market will create pollution. A classic example would be a factory that's making some manufactured product. The seller of that product might be perfectly happy, and the buyer of the product might be perfectly happy, but third parties could be affected by the air and water pollution created by the firm. But, one example doesn't prove a general point, and the connection from market production to the environment is maybe less obvious than it at first appears. At a personal level, get a little defensive here, but at a personal level, I'm an economist, but I like canoeing and camping. I drive a hybrid gas-electric car. I recycle my newspapers in cans. I am not the only economist who does this. Conversely, most of the people I know who I would think of as strong environmentalists also drive cars and thus create air pollution, and they create garbage as well. Of course, these individual examples don't prove a broad point either. But here's some systematic evidence. Poor countries with weak markets often have environmental problems that are much worse than rich market-oriented countries. Countries which have tried to eliminate free market forces, like the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, have had some just terrible pollution problems. As the U.S. economy has grown in recent decades, U.S. air and water quality has actually improved on average. Doesn't mean the problems have gone away, but the amount of pollution has been reduced. So perhaps the issue here is the interaction between government and how production happens, not whether it's a free market or not a free market. Perhaps a government which provides a background of contracts and property rights that prevents theft and thus makes a free market possible, can also provide a background of law and regulation to assure that clean air and water are not, in a figurative sense, stolen from people either. Let's investigate the economics of pollution and of how to reduce pollution. The central concept here is the idea of an externality. An externality occurs when a party who is outside of the immediate buyer and seller is directly affected by a transaction. Now, the argument for free markets and why free markets benefit a society is based in part on the notion that when a buyer and a seller voluntarily agree on a purchase, then at least in their own judgment, the deal must have benefited both sides. But when a market transaction affects a third party who was not consulted and did not have to pay as the buyer or receive money as a seller, then this argument that markets benefit all parties does not hold as well. Now, when I talk about a third party being affected, I don't just mean that they disapproved of the transaction for some reason, but I mean that it has a concrete effect on them. So let me give you an example of an externality that could be either positive or negative. Consider an apartment complex where one household hires a really loud band for a party. You can imagine maybe it's New Year's Eve or something like that. Now, the band is happy to be hired. The neighbor who hired the band is happy to hire them. But what about you in the next apartment over? Well, if you really like the music from the loud band, you get a positive externality. You basically get a private concert in your apartment and you get it for free. If you don't like it, then you suffer a negative externality. You have to listen to this music that you didn't want to. But either way, the market deal between your neighbor and the band is not taking you into account. This lecture focuses on pollution, which is probably the most important social example of a negative externality. The next lecture will focus on the most important positive externalities, particularly technology and the development of innovation. To economists, pollution is just a case where third parties are affected by the spillovers from production and consumption decisions, and those third parties were not part of the original market transaction. In the case of the band, you can think of it as noise pollution that's coming over to your place. But you can think of pollution as anything you didn't want, really, but that's something that is imposed on you by the actions of others. For example, cigarette smoke is not pollution to the smoker. The smoker voluntarily agreed to purchase cigarettes. However, it might be pollution to the third party who was not part of the market transaction. And of course, air and water pollution broadly fall into the same category. The idea of an externality can be explained by distinguishing between private costs and social costs. In a typical market transaction, the firm looks at the private costs that it faces when it does the production, and the buyer looks at the private benefits that the buyer receives, and they see whether they can make a deal. But in the case of pollution, not all the costs are private costs that the producer has to pay. Some of the costs are cost of pollution, which are imposed on others. These social costs of pollution are not paid by the firm, and since they aren't paid by the firm won't take them into account. When producers of something that does pollution don't have to take social costs into account, they will tend to produce too much of it. Think back for a moment to the example of the band in the apartment building. What if the neighbors giving that party had to compensate everyone in the building $50 apiece for the inconvenience of having a loud band? Well, they would probably hire the band for a shorter time, or they would hire a quieter band so they only had to pay people $20 instead of $50, or they might not hire the band at all. But if they had to face the social costs of that band, then they would produce less noise pollution. Or you can think of an example of a firm that doesn't have to pay anything at all for dumping its garbage. If it doesn't have to pay anything at all for dumping its garbage, there's likely to be a lot of garbage that's generated and a lot of stuff dumped. But all of a sudden, if that firm has to start paying for dumping its garbage, all of a sudden the firm finds a lot of ways to reduce how much garbage it's creating. And it might start finding ways to reduce its waste and to recycle. And after all, when you think about it, pollution is just garbage, which is dumped into the air or into the water. Now, there are a range of public policies that are available to try and bring private and social costs into line with each other, so that those who are creating the costs of pollution also have to face those costs more directly. Command and control is the name economists give to the set of regulatory policies that specify an amount of pollution that can legally be emitted, but prohibits emitting any larger amount of pollution. Early environmental regulation in the United States in the early 1970s, with the passage of the original Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, essentially took this command and control approach. Now, this approach certainly can be and has been effective. In the most fundamental sense, the air and water, on average, are cleaner now than they were in the early 1970s. People forget what it was like then. Let me give you an example. In the early 1970s, air pollution was so bad in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that, and I'm quoting from a news story here, the death rate from tuberculosis was double that of the rest of Tennessee and triple that of the rest of the United States. This was a city in which the filth in the air was so bad it melted nylon stockings off women's legs, in which executives kept supplies of clean white shirts in their offices so they could change when a shirt became too gray to be presentable. A city in which headlights were turned on at high noon because the sun was eclipsed by the gunk in the sky. I mean, that's what air pollution was like. It's come a long way since then. Since then, many major air pollutants have been considerably reduced. I'm looking at some statistics here from the Environmental Protection Agency. But from 1970 to 2001, the level of particulates in the air fell by 76%. The level of sulfur dioxide in the air fell by 44%. The level of what are called volatile organic compounds, certain kind of chemicals in the air, fell by 38%. The level of carbon monoxide in the air fell by 19%. The level of lead in the air, which was particularly harmful to small children and developmental issues for small kids growing up, fell by 98%, mainly as a result of unleaded gasoline. So the air has definitely become much cleaner over time, even if there are remaining issues like whether or not carbon dioxide may be causing greenhouse warming that we'll talk about later on. It's harder to measure water quality in a consistent way than air quality, but the widespread construction of much better sewage treatment plants and also better provisions for disposing of wastewater from firms has made a huge difference. So when they go out and they do sort of surveys of the rivers and streams and lakes, in general, many more of them are swimmable or fishable or useful for recreational purposes than was true 35 years ago. Now, I don't mean to dismiss or diminish these genuine achievements of command and control environmental regulation when I say that this kind of regulation does have some weaknesses. Let me try and describe the weaknesses in terms of the incentives that it provides to the industry being regulated. One weakness is that the industry being regulated with command and control regulation might seek to influence the pollution standard through the regulatory process. Remember, there's this problem of regulatory capture, and they may try and get the standard set at a higher level. Another difficulty is that command and control regulatory standards are quite inflexible. They often specify exactly what kind of technology is supposed to be used to reduce a certain kind of pollution. Whether it's the best technology in that particular situation, or whether that technology is one size fits all across the country or should be different in different places, is often not particularly addressed. Moreover, command and control regulation often does not reward innovative ways of avoiding pollution in the first place, or reducing pollution below the legal standard. If you're below the legal standard, that's okay. There's no reason to keep reducing pollution lower and lower and lower. Now, one estimate is that a result of this lack of flexibility in these command and control regulations, this lack of incentives for going beyond the standard and perhaps reducing pollution even further. It might be, by some economic estimates, that the costs society faces for cleaning up pollution might be literally 2 times as high as necessary. So we could either be cleaning up the existing amount of pollution at half the cost, or we could be cleaning up even more pollution and still having a lower social cost than we do now. So what's the alternative to command and control regulation? The answer would be something that are called market-oriented environmental policies. And the goal here, as you'll be getting this sort of broken record of goal over time, is to work with the market, work with the forces of the market and the incentives the market provides, rather than trying to just command it and control it to do what you want. Let me suggest several flavors of market-oriented environmental policies. One is called a pollution tax. A pollution tax could be used to make sure that polluters face up to the social cost of their pollution. Now, how would a pollution tax work? You would pay a certain amount of this tax per unit of pollution. So, for example, it could be based on emissions of carbon, or emissions of sulfur dioxide, or emissions of stuff that goes into the water. You can view the federal gasoline tax or state gasoline taxes as kind of a cousin of a pollution tax. It's not taxing the pollutant directly, like the carbon or the other things that are emitted, but it's taxing as something that creates pollution as is used. Now, maybe it's not particularly politically attractive to call something a pollution tax, but you could call it a pollution charge if you want, which sort of has a nicer sound. My point here is not the semantics of the pollution tax, but the notion that you could tax according to how much pollution is emitted. Now, a pollution tax has some very nice features in terms of incentives. For example, a pollution tax gives a reason for continuous innovation in trying to reduce the amount of pollution. Because as long as the firm can reduce pollution, it can reduce its pollution tax. So it's not like command and control. You get below a certain level and you just stop trying to reduce pollution. With a pollution tax, you just keep going and going. Moreover, a pollution tax provides some cash for the government, which, given the state of the federal deficits these few years, the government could certainly handle. A pollution tax also provides no particular method in how to reduce pollution. It's very flexible. It doesn't say you have to reduce pollution using this particular technology, this particular way, this particular time. It just says if you emit, you pay. Now, of course, in a way, a pollution tax is more visible than command and control regulation. It doesn't say this is what you have to do. It really requires you to measure what you're emitting. And that's not always very attractive to firms. It's also called a tax, and as I said, calling it a tax may not be as politically attractive. But it would force firms to face up to the fact that pollution has a social cost, and to pay that cost directly. And that sets up a nice set of incentives for reducing pollution. Let me give you another market-oriented environmentalism way of reducing pollution. It's called marketable permits. A marketable permit works by giving polluters a set of permits to emit a certain amount of pollution. Now, often these permits are scheduled to gradually decrease the amount of pollution that can be emitted over time. They sort of reduce in a phased down way. That maybe you can emit 100 units and then 80 and then 60 and then 40. However, if a polluter can reduce pollution by more than the amount of the permit, then the permit could be sold to someone else. That's why it's a marketable permit. Or if a new producer wants to enter the market, that new producer has to purchase an emissions permit, a pollution permit from some existing firm. The United States has had some success with marketable permits in certain areas. For example, it was one of the ways that was used to reduce lead in gasoline, that there were marketable permits that could be sold to firms that processed and refined gasoline and then phased down the amount of gasoline over time. It also worked for the reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions that was particularly related to the 1990 version of the Clean Air Act. Firms were given permits to emit a certain amount of sulfur dioxide, and then the amount of those permits ratcheted down over time. Again, if you think about the incentives that these marketable permits provide, they provide a reason to innovate. Because after all, if you can reduce pollution by more, then you can sell the extra permits to others. However, many environmentalists have pretty mixed feelings about these marketable permits. On one side, environmentalists often like the marketable permits because it sets a quantitative limit on the amount of pollution. The pollution tax, remember, didn't set a quantitative limit. It just said if you emit, you pay. And so environmentalists were sometimes concerned, well, how much is actually going to be emitted? But with marketable permits, there's a quantity of permits that are out there. On the other hand, environmentalists often dislike marketable permits because it sounds like social permission to pollute, which of course it is. A marketable permit is social permission to pollute. But, when you think about it, command and control regulation is also social permission to pollute up to a certain level. The only difference is that command and control regulation doesn't give you any incentives to proceed further. Let me give you yet another method of a market-oriented way of controlling pollution. It's to use property rights. The property rights that you have can often affect the incentive to produce or to reduce pollution. Now, let's think about how this might work. One way of thinking about this problem of pollution and property rights is that in an unregulated market, no one has a property right to clean air. And if nobody has a property right to clean air, no one needs to compensate you for infringing on your property right to clean air. If you have a property right to own your land, somebody can't come in your front yard and dump garbage because you own that property. But you don't own the air over your property in the same sense. If you had property rights that were clear and enforceable, then one party or another will have the appropriate incentives to avoid creating the negative externality of pollution. So, let's think about this difficulty of how you might have property rights that could be used in a way to avoid getting the air dirty or having water pollution of one kind or another. A classic example here is due to the great Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase. Coase said that what you wanted to do was think about a train that goes past a farmer's field. And that train is emitting sparks. And sometimes the sparks start a fire in the farmer's field. So we want to think about this example of pollution. The train, it's emitting sparks, the farmer's field is burning. How do we figure out a way to deal with this through property rights? Now, we can tackle this in two different ways. One is we could say, look, a train has a property right to emit sparks. In which case, farmer, it's up to you. You have to figure out how to reduce the chance of fire hitting your field. Alternatively, you could say, look, farmers, you have a property right not to have your field set on fire by sparks from the train. In which case, the railroad has to find a way to reduce the chance of fire or else pay the farmer. Now, whether you give the property right to the railroad and let it emit sparks, or you give the property right to the farmer and say you are protected from the emissions of sparks, that will determine who has to pay. But either way, if the property right is clear, one party has a reason to find a way to reduce the chance of fire and to find the low-cost way of doing that. So when the property rights are clear, often there will be some reason to try and avoid pollution from happening. A classic example would be the ownership of federal lands. No one really owns often federal lands, and so they end up sometimes being abused for various recreational or logging or hunting or other kinds of purposes because they aren't owned. No one has a reason in terms of a property right to protect them. Another application of this idea today is about protecting endangered species. Think about the problem of protecting elephants or rhinoceroses in Africa. If no one owns the elephants or the rhinoceroses, then they're poached for the ivory in their tusks, and their habitat is destroyed for farmland and so on. But if you put them in a sort of a park where they're protected, and then you give everyone who lives around the park an economic incentive